Joshua trees are a big asset for California. And every year, over 3 million people visit Joshua Tree National Park. But for towns around the Joshua Tree National Park, they are becoming a hassle. Our guest today is Curtis Yakimow, who's a town manager of Yucca Valley. He's here to tell us how Joshua trees in the last couple of years have been added to the Endangered Species Act as a candidate, and that's stopped all sorts of developments for the community, for the city, and for the residents.
I don't believe that the Fish and Game Commission, when they've heard of these incidents come in, I wouldn't even think the environmental proponents of preservation of the Joshua tree would think that that's a good outcome.
I'm Siama Korami. Welcome to California Insider. Curtis, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're the town manager of Yucca Valley,
Yes.
which is a rural community in California. There's an endangered species law that's really impacting your community. Tell us what this is about.
Yucca Valley is a small community. We're about 25 miles north of Palm Springs, California. In between Palm Springs and 29 Palms, where the big military base is at. We have about 21,500. Our population really hasn't changed all that much. And as we said, it's a rural community. We're known for our proximity to the Joshua Tree National Park. We're right adjacent. In fact, one of the campgrounds for Joshua Tree National Park, Black Rock Campground, is in just outside the boundary of Yucca Valley. People come from all over the world and the United States and California to Joshua Tree National Park, not only to view the landscape, but really to view the Western Joshua tree. It's an amazing plant, tree. Not sure exactly what it's called on the scientific basis, but it's a beautiful tree, and people come to look at it from all over the place. We've had in Yucca Valley protections for that tree for many, many years, since incorporation in our native plant ordinance. We've identified that it's of value, and it has characteristics that are not in other species, and so we've protected that. Recently, there was a petition brought forward to the California Fish and Game Commission to list the Western Joshua tree as an endangered species in accordance with the California Endangered Species Act. We call it for short CESA. So that's California Endangered Species Act. And the Western Joshua tree was proposed as a candidate, what's called a candidate species. Ultimately, the Fish and Game Commission did not vote yet to place it as a protected species, but rather they left it as a candidate species. According to California law, if a species is a candidate species, it receives the exact same protections as if it is protected and listed. So with that in place, residents, anyone that was in proximity to a Western Joshua tree was prohibited from what's called a take. And you would think, well, maybe a take is the removal of a tree. It's not. It can be touching the tree. It can be not touching the tree, but being in proximity, depending on how that proximity is defined, without even touching the tree. You cannot do anything without what's called an incidental take permit. Now, that's current in place. And so in Yucca Valley, we have neighborhoods in Yucca Valley that are basically woodland Western Joshua tree communities. And so you can have a parcel with 50, 75 trees on it in your backyard. Some of the challenge that we have, I'd say, are probably twofold. One is for our resident, a small property owner that has just a regular property, and they may need to do basic infrastructure work. Yucca Valley is a rural community. Many of the neighborhoods were built before incorporation, when it was unincorporated county area. They're still on septic tanks. If they have to remove a septic tank, they have to get a permit, and based on the current guidelines and guidance that's being proposed by the department currently through their conservation plan, there's a buffer zone of 50 feet around every tree. So you can imagine now, and we actually did this, we brought in an independent consultant to take a look at 3 properties as an example. If we needed to remove the septic tank and the homeowner needed to put a new one in, what would the mitigation fees be associated with the Western Joshua
Because you
tree
have
fee?
to move, or you might be touching an area close to the
Or you
tree.
might be within 50
Within
feet.
50
of a
feet,
tree,
even if you don't
it's
touch it.
Correct. Yeah. Those fees for those homeowners are estimated at $40,000 to $60,000 just for the permit to do their work.
Just to get the permit.
Correct. Without doing the work.
So essentially, is the penalty for touching that
For
area.
being in proximity to the Western Joshua tree. You know, we're very cooperative with all of the agencies that are involved in this issue. And I don't believe that the Fish and Game Commission, when they've heard of these incidents come in, the department staff, the legislatures, and quite frankly, I wouldn't even think the environmental proponents of preservation of the Joshua tree would think that that's a good outcome. It doesn't make any sense. There's not been any movement yet on how to address that. And so that's really where we're at today. It's a challenge for our individual homeowners to be able just to do, whether it's infrastructure like a water line or a septic tank or building a garage or an accessory dwelling unit. All of those require what's called a ground disturbing permit. And you have to be in compliance now with the Western Joshua Tree Act as well as California Endangered Species Act with respect to the Western Joshua tree. So it's a tremendous issue for our local residents and our homeowners. That's the first primary concern. The second primary concern is that there is not clear guidance yet on how do you manage this in projects. And so, for example, the town of Yucca Valley has a state guideline of how many homes we need to address our housing need in Yucca Valley. And our current number is around 800 that's been identified. So we need about 800 new homes to be able to keep up with the housing demand in our area. We don't have significant areas of vacant land without Joshua trees. So we have, for example, we have a couple of parcels that may be 20, 40, 60 acres where a developer can come in and potentially do a housing development. They would have to mitigate for the Western Joshua trees that are on that parcel. And we have some areas where you would have literally tens of thousands of Joshua trees, and not full-grown Joshua trees, but the way that it's defined is a Joshua tree is anything from a sprout in the ground to a full-grown tree. So you may have one tree, it looks like one or two trees, but when you go down around the base of it, there may be 20 trees or 30 trees because they're sprouts.
And 50 feet around those.
Correct, yes. And so what it's caused basically is developers in Yucca Valley to say, time out, there's too much uncertainty here. We don't know how we would pass that cost on to the potential home buyer. And it becomes a real problem for being able to deliver some of those housing units that are so required in our area.
We're going to pause our conversation with Curtis to talk to local residents. We sit down with Madelaine LaVoie to see how they are impacted. Can you tell us how you guys are impacted?
It's been actually really a horrible situation. We have permit issues. For example, I'm about to do an addition on my daughter's home. And in doing so, I had to get a special permit done with an arborist. And so this arborist had to come and say, this is how many Joshua trees you have and fill in the gaps, so to speak. And there was no Joshua trees on her particular lot, but I still had to pay $850 for a piece of paper that said that she doesn't have any Joshua trees on her lot. Now, if I had Joshua trees on the lot, I would then have to do permits for each Joshua tree. It can be as high as $2,500 per tree for just the permit. There's permit fees that are absolutely extraordinary, and it makes it almost completely impossible to build on any lot that has Joshua trees within a 50-foot radius of where you plan to build. A Joshua tree is a root tree like a palm tree. So it doesn't have those tentacle type roots like oak tree. Like the California oak tree is one of the trees that are protected, and with good reason. They're beautiful California oak tree. I love them, and I think it's great that they're protected. However, the root ball is different. It doesn't need that extra space. And I have 5 Joshua trees in my own yard, and they are all closer than 50 feet to my home. And I've lived in my home for over 30 years with 0 problems to my Joshua trees. And I have baby Joshua trees jumping out all the time. I've actually, over the years, not recently, but over the years, given them to my friends to plant in their yards because people want to have Joshua trees. Now it's becoming a liability because that problem of anything you need to do has to be encompassed around these trees, such as, let's say, for example, we have septic tanks. So if you have to replace your septic tank and there is a tree within, let's say, 10 feet of your septic tank, that Joshua tree is then, you're going to do ground disturbing actions at too close to that tree, and you're not going to be allowed to change your septic tank. I mean, that's a big issue. Same with the leach field. Leach fields connect to a septic, same situation. So we need to have some sort of compliance regulation things to be adopted by the state that will allow us to use our properties and have our property rights without this affecting us so horribly. And it really shouldn't be on infill lots. I mean, these are already lots. There's house. There's a lot, and there's a house. And so you have this one vacant lot, and there's a Josh tree in the middle of it. Suddenly it becomes an unbuildable lot. I'd love to have some government regulation person come in and fix it. I have been kind of stomping my feet, but I'm just one little broker in a little town, and I don't think very many people realize how impactful this is for, well, our town, I think, is 37,000 people, but it expands way beyond that. It affects hundreds of thousands of people. It affects Lancaster, Palmdale, Visalia, Hemet. I mean, it's not just here that gets impacted. We have Morongo Valley, Yucca Valley, Pioneer Town, Josh Tree. All these areas that have many Joshua trees are really impacted by this.
How's the real estate market impacted?
There's many people that own their own property here that cannot afford the extra fees, and so they cannot build on their own land. It's become really tragic. There's one guy in particular, Alec Mackey, who's trying to build his retirement home up in Juniper Terrace, one of our neighborhoods. And he literally cannot build his retirement home that he already has plans to build because of the Joshua trees.
How much is the fee for a vacant lot? How much fees do they have to pay for the Joshua trees, like on average?
Well, it's by the number of trees and the size of the trees. The fees range from $150 to $2,500 per tree for just the permit fee. And then on top of that, you pay for the arborist. And then you have to submit everything with outlines, and all the trees have to be marked. And then you have to pay the arborist to move trees that are impactful to the site. And so then you have to pay for those to be moved properly. It's extraordinarily expensive. I mean, we're looking at probably $20,000 to $30,000 before you're done, just to prep your lot, getting ready to build.
Now let's go back to Curtis to see how the local public infrastructure has been impacted by this law. What about your own projects? You have infrastructure projects, right?
Yeah, we have a developed parkland in Yucca Valley, in the center of Yucca Valley. We are fortunate to be underway with what's called our Yucca Valley Aquatics and Recreation Center. It's about a $40 million project with an indoor pool and a gymnasium in an existing parkway. In that parkway, on the north side of the property, there was a dirt road that goes around the park that we are paving to provide circulation. Along that dirt road, if you just looked at it from a distance, you'd say, oh, I see about maybe 10 or 11 trees that might need to be moved. We had to go to the state in accordance with the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act and ask for an incidental take permit. First thing that you're required to do is compliance with CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. CEQA is a process where you have to go do the studies, you have to provide data and other information that's required by California law. That process takes about 6 to 9 months. It was about a cost of about $25,000 to the Yucca Valley taxpayer. That's number one. Number two, you have to get the incidental take permit for the Western Joshua tree. The Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act provided a path for us to do that and identified a mitigation fee. So the department evaluated our request. They said, okay, yeah, we understand this is a public works project. We're going to give you an incidental take permit. You can remove these trees, but remember, we're going to count every tree. So instead of the view of 10 to 15 trees, it ended up being around 73 trees because they're counting every stem. There's a fee for every one of those. In addition, not only did they allow us to take the tree, some of the trees, they also had a requirement that you had to transplant some of the trees. So it's like a tree spade, and it comes in and you're able to lift the tree out. In order to transplant, they want to have a relocation plan performed by a biologist. Where are you going to plant it? What's your management for the new tree going to be? What's that proximity of that new tree going to be to other trees and might endanger other trees? So we had to prepare that with the biologist. That process, with the mitigation fees, the entire process to get a permit just for this one road in an existing park was about $110,000 to the Yucca Valley taxpayer. And it took us about a year. One of the really ironic examples that we have currently underway is a public works project. We're not the lead agency. The lead agency is the High Desert Water District. About 15 years ago, the state, through the Department of Water Resources, basically issued what's called a discharge prohibition order for Yucca Valley Incorporated town limits. And that discharge prohibition was related to septic discharge. So it gave a timeline where you had to phase out the use of septic systems in Yucca Valley, and that was done under the guise of improving water quality. We broke that up into a couple of different phases. The taxpayers voted to tax themselves to get the first phase done. That was completed in about 2014, 2015, 2016 timeframe. It was before any of the new regulations related to the Western Joshua tree. So in that process, the facility was built for a centralized wastewater treatment system. Distribution lines, collection lines were placed into the infrastructure, and homes were connected. And that first phase covered about 4,000 homes, 4,000 to 5,000 homes. Second phase still needs to be done. And recently, the High Desert Water District received a grant from one of the state departments for about $103 million to be able to move forward with the second phase of the sewer system. Everybody was thrilled. This is an amazing opportunity for us to do it. The High Desert Water District realized that after consultation with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, they received direction that, oh, you're going to need an incidental take permit for your project. And they said, well, we're just putting lines in the middle of the existing street. We're not touching Joshua trees. Yes, but in accordance with our current guidelines, you're going to be within 50 feet of the trees. That means that for every tree that you're within 50 feet of as you put in your sewer lines, it will be a take, which will have a mitigation fee. It was estimated that out of the $100 million in grant funds for this project, 15 to 20 million might have to be paid for mitigation fees for the Western Joshua tree, which means that many more homes might not get finished. That many more miles of collection system might not get installed. And we would be using grant funds, the High Desert Water District would be using grant funds to pay another state agency.
Taking it from one agency and giving it to another agency.
And not providing the maximum benefit for the property owner. That process is still underway. And when the Fish and Game Commission heard about this at their meeting in February, their response was predictable in that, well, that doesn't really make sense, does it? but that's what we're given under the current legislation and the current law under California Endangered Species Act, CISA. So I think there's a recognition of the challenges that the regulations impose, but there's not yet a will or a path forward to resolve it. And there can be.
You mentioned that it will count as a take. What does a take mean?
A take is defined in law by the California Endangered Species Act, and I can't remember the specifics of that definition, but in layman's terms, it is any impact on the tree or any impact on whatever species they're trying to protect. So in this case, you have the Western Joshua tree, and a take could be digging 10 feet away from the tree if it potentially might or results in damage to the tree or the root base or weakens the tree or the tree dies 2 years later, and they can ascribe that to work that was done disturbing the tree. Take can also mean cutting a branch. If you have a dead tree and the branch is hanging down and needs to be trimmed so it doesn't hurt somebody, that would be a take. Now there is a separate permitting process for what they call hazard mitigation. But generally speaking, take is anything to do with the tree. Whether you actually remove the tree or not is not part of the definition.
So it's really treated the same if you come close to it.
Correct.
Within 50 feet. And what's the charge for each take?
The Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act provides a scale of fees, mitigation fees, and they're based on size of the tree. So I think they have 3 different categories, and it goes from anywhere from $200 up to $2,000 per tree, depending on size of the tree and your location from a national park. Of course, in Yucca Valley, our proximity to the Joshua Tree National Park is close. So many of our properties would fall into the higher fee category.
It seems like the law is not really designed for a community. It's really designed for the wildlife and the park areas.
It's one size fits all. And that's really the frustration, one of the frustrations that we have. It doesn't recognize the built environment. It doesn't recognize that we may have development in a wooded area or woodland area that they're just native in Yucca Valley. And so somebody may have bought 40 years ago and they have 200 trees on their property. And now they're being essentially punished because of that.
What was the process before for the town?
We had our native plant ordinance, which was in town development code and town regulations of how the Western Joshua tree, along with a number of other native species to the town in our local geographical area, are managed. And so the individual that would be proposing a project would come in and identify, these are my native plants that I have, that they still have to do that today for other plants, just not the Western Joshua tree, because now that's done at the state level. These are the plants that may be moved or impacted, and this is my plan for dealing with it. And some are allowed, some may not be allowed, depending on what type of project it is or what zoning area that you may be in. We had that process, worked very well for many years. We've had critics that said, oh, well, you had violators of your native plant ordinance. Did we have violators? Sure. No different than somebody running a red light. That doesn't mean that you remove the ability to travel on the streets. You enforce, which we did, and you correct through the mechanisms that are provided for in your ordinance. So those cases, I think, are really more obviously the exception rather than the norm. And the process worked well from incorporation, 1991, all the way through about 2020. So many, many years. And then this process now is the replacement, and it's done at the state level. And quite frankly, I think one of the things that we've talked about many times is it would be great for the Fish and Game commissioners, for the department staff, for the legislatures to come out to Yucca Valley. We've invited them many times. Come walk a neighborhood with us. Take a look at the property owners that we have. Talk to the property owners. Let's develop a solution that makes sense. And it's interesting because if you think about, well, can a solution be developed? Yeah, of course it can. If you think through, as an example, when there's a priority that's a priority of the state or the state legislature, can they make things happen quickly? You bet. What happened after the fires, the terrible fires in January of this year? The next day, the governor and the administration was down in the area taking a tour. And shortly after that, in the rebuilding process, two specific actions came out of the administration. One was, we'll suspend CEQA for all of the rebuilding process. It's an impediment to rebuilding quickly. We understand that. We're going to suspend that. We're also going to moderate the ability for the California Coastal Commission to have input on project redevelopment as these homes are built. Normally, the Coastal Commission is very, very powerful in their ability to set regulation. So by a stroke of a pen, both of those were basically suspended on the rebuild process. And I think it's just a recognition at the ground level of these environmental regulations that are put in place, I think for generally good reasons, don't always accommodate the smallest homeowner that needs to be able to use their property in the way that it's intended to be used.
Essentially, you are in trouble if you have a lot of these Joshua trees in your backyard.
Oh, of course.
Because it will cost you a lot to...
Yes, yeah, and going back to the example of the ability of somebody to do a small housing tract development, for example, 50, 60 homes. I have developers that have called me. They're property owners that they bought the property 20 years ago with the idea to build a small community of homes for the needs that are in our area. They don't have visibility and they don't have certainty, and the costs are too high with the existing cost structure for them to move forward. So they just shelf the project, or even worse, they just put the property on the market. The property's not moving right now because of the uncertainty in the area. There are other communities in California, in the high desert. You have Apple Valley, Hesperia, Palmdale, Adelanto. Some of those communities are facing similar challenges. I would suggest that on a per capita basis, Yucca Valley is the epicenter of Western Joshua trees in the built environment. And so that's why it's so acute of a problem in Yucca Valley.
How does the Department of Fish and Wildlife is actually looking at these violations? If people are doing something in their backyard and they're coming 50 feet close to their trees, how do they enforce it?
For the town, because now the regulation is not town regulation, we defer all of those reports of potential violations to the department, and they do have part of their operation is enforcement, and I presume that they take necessary steps. But it's difficult, I think, even for the department to know exactly how far and how fast to enforce, because some of the regulation guidelines are not very clear. So let's talk a little bit about kind of where we're at now and where we see this going. Right now, as part of the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act, it had a number of different requirements. One of the requirements was for the Department of Fish and Wildlife to produce what's called a conservation plan. They've done that initial draft, and that was presented to the Fish and Game Commission in accordance with the timeline at the end of 2024. It had its first hearing in February of 2025, where the Fish and Game Commission took public comment. So many of our residents participated in that meeting, provided input, provided concerns. The Fish and Game Commission was, I would say, sympathetic toward understanding some of these impacts on the residents. The next step in that process is this month in April, next week, the Fish and Game Commission will be receiving an update on the conservation plan and the input that they heard from residents and others around the state on this issue. And then they need to finish that conservation plan and approve it by June. And so that's the current timeline. As part of the February meeting, the Fish and Game Commission heard some of the comments and concerns, and they suggested that it would be good to see some accommodation to be able to address this, but we don't know how to get there. We don't know whether it can be done in the conservation plan or if it needs to be a legislative fix. From a town's perspective, we're open to working with our partners in any way possible to get a solution. We think that if the executive administration at the state level was aware of this issue and how it impacts a homeowner, we would have movement pretty quickly on a legislative fix. Through our local assemblyman and senator, we're in contact with them and trying to encourage them to provide a legislative fix. And what does that mean? What's a legislative fix? It can be very simple. It can be, as I indicated earlier, the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act provides two different types of permits. You can get a permit, which is called a hazard mitigation permit, to trim your tree. If it fell over in an emergency and it's in your driveway, you can get a permit very quick. You still need a permit to touch it, but you can get a permit to move it, get it out of the way, and that's at no cost. And you are not required to
pay any fines or penalties.
Anything, yes. And so that's done at no cost and relatively quickly by state standards. I think it has to be done within 10 days. Of course, if it's laying in your driveway, 10 days is a long time. But that's one type of permit. And then the next type is where you're required to do the CEQA study and the full mitigation fees. A legislative fix might provide a third type of permit, which might be called a ministerial permit. Ministerial meaning if you have a public work project that's in your property and it's a small property lot, residential lot, and you need to do something there, they can have the same type of permitting function where you can get a permit from us, it needs to be done quickly, there's no CEQA requirement, and there's no mitigation fee. That would address probably about 80% of the concerns that we have. It doesn't address some of the long-term uncertainty on vacant lands, but as far as the residential impact, relatively straightforward fix, we would think. So it's just trying to get that exposure to both the policymakers and our elected officials to realize this is a real issue. This has real impacts on residents in their areas. We need to be able to respond to that in an appropriate way.
Curtis Yakimow, Town Manager of Yucca Valley, it was great to have you on California Insider.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful experience, and I look forward to sharing with the public.
After sitting down with Curtis and Madelaine LaVoie, we heard that the Department of Fish and Wildlife in California is trying really hard to come up with a solution for this Joshua Tree issue. We also want to let you know that the people that have come up with this law, they really care about these trees, and these trees are a big asset to California. They're trying to protect it. These trees bring 3 million visitors to this park, and they're also very beautiful and something that we should treasure here in California. Let us know what you think of this situation. You can always email us at siamak@californiainsider.com or comment. We read all of your emails and comments. I'm Siamak Korami, this is California Insider, and we'll see you next time.